The night was quiet in the small suburban neighborhood. The stars shone faintly above, their distant light barely filtering through the haze of city lights in the distance. The air was cool, with a slight breeze rustling through the trees. It was a peaceful evening, one that felt like nothing could possibly go wrong. But for Sarah, the night was just beginning to unravel in ways she couldn't have predicted. She had been a babysitter for years, with numerous families asking for her help to watch their children on weekends like this one. She was always careful, always professional, and she knew how to handle the small anxieties that came with the job. This evening, however, felt different. The house she had been hired to sit in was far larger than she had expected, tucked away at the edge of town on a quiet street. It looked well maintained, the lawn perfectly manicured, and the windows dark behind thick curtains. As she walked up the driveway, she couldn't help but feel an odd sensation, a shiver that ran down her spine for no apparent reason. When she rang the doorbell, a woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile greeted her. Mrs. Hall, the mother of the child she was to watch, was in her late 30s, with a soft but tired expression, as though she hadn't had a good night's sleep in a while. She welcomed Sarah inside and explained the rules of the house. Emily is a sweet girl, but she's a little different. You'll see what I mean when you meet her. Just be patient with her, okay? Mrs. Hall said, her voice laced with both concern and exhaustion. We won't be gone too long. She should be in bed by 9, but I'm sure she'll want to show you her toys or maybe tell you about her little friends. Sarah nodded, though she felt a small pang of unease at the mention of little friends. It wasn't unusual for children to have imaginary companions, but there was something in the way Mrs. Hall said it that made Sarah's stomach twist slightly. Mrs. Hall handed her the house keys and a brief rundown of the night's schedule before heading out the door, leaving Sarah alone in the large, dimly lit house. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. As Sarah walked through the hallway toward the living room, she heard a faint sound coming from upstairs, a soft, high-pitched giggle that didn't seem quite natural. She froze, unsure if she had imagined it. Shaking off the odd sensation, she ascended the stairs toward Emily's room. The door creaked as Sarah pushed it open, and she was met by the sight of a small, dark-haired girl sitting on the floor surrounded by a haphazard collection of dolls, stuffed animals, and various toys. Emily looked up when she saw Sarah, her large eyes gleaming with an odd intensity. Hi, I'm Sarah. Your mom said you might want to show me some of your toys. Sarah said, trying to sound reassuring, though she felt the strange weight of the room pressing in around her. Emily didn't respond at first. She simply stared at Sarah, her expression unreadable. There was something unsettling about the way she looked, as though she was studying her every movement with an unnerving level of awareness. Who are you? Emily finally asked, her voice soft but somehow piercing. Sarah was taken aback for a moment. I'm Sarah. I'm here to watch over you tonight while your mom and dad are out. I can help you with anything you need. Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, as though she was deciding whether or not to believe her. Then she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. You're not real. Sarah frowned, unsure how to respond. What do you mean I'm not real? The little girl reached out and touched Sarah's arm with a cold, trembling hand. Her fingers lingered there for a moment, too long, before she pulled back. You can't stay. You'll see them soon. See who? Sarah asked, her heart beginning to race as a knot of dread formed in her stomach. Emily simply smiled, an eerie, knowing smile that sent a chill crawling up Sarah's spine. The others, they're waiting for you. The room felt colder suddenly, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was off about the way Emily spoke, about the way she looked at her. She'd met children with vivid imaginations before, but this was different. Emily's eyes gleamed with something far too mature for a girl her age. Before Sarah could ask anything more, there was a loud bang from behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked, the door was still shut. The hallway outside was quiet. Emily didn't seem to notice Sarah's rising anxiety. She was already back to playing with her toys, her back turned toward her. Sarah stood frozen, her pulse quickening as she glanced around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been, as though something was lurking just out of sight. "Are you sure you don't want to sleep now?" Sarah asked, her voice trying to sound calm. "Your mom said it's time for bed." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she hummed softly to herself, almost as if she hadn't heard Sarah's question at all. It was then that Sarah noticed something even stranger. One of Emily's dolls, a small porcelain figure, was facing the corner of the room. It was sitting upright, with its eyes wide open, staring directly at the wall. But it was the way the doll's eyes were staring, unnaturally wide, that made Sarah's blood run cold. The silence stretched on. Emily's humming grew quieter, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, denser. Sarah could barely breathe, her skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. "Are you ready for bed, Emily?" Sarah asked again, trying to break the tension in the air. Emily's eyes flicked to her, and this time, the smile that spread across her face wasn't the innocent one she'd had before. It was something else entirely, something that made Sarah's stomach twist into knots. "You'll see them soon," Emily whispered again, her voice like a soft echo in the room. "They're not so friendly." And just as Sarah was about to ask what she meant, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The soft hum of the house's electricity stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sarah's breath hitched as the sudden silence settled around her like a heavy blanket. Her pulse quickened in her chest, and she instinctively reached for her phone, only to realize it was too dark to see the screen. She fumbled, her fingers shaking as she tried to turn on the flashlight. "Emily?" Sarah called, trying to mask the edge of panic creeping into her voice. "Emily, where are you?" She heard the soft shuffle of small feet on the carpet. Emily's voice followed, but it was much closer this time, right beside her ear. "You shouldn't have come," the little girl whispered, her words sending a chill down Sarah's spine. It sounded as though Emily was standing in the darkness just inches away from her, but Sarah couldn't see anything. "They've been waiting." The air felt thicker now, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around Sarah. She took a step back, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She reached out for the wall to steady herself, but something didn't feel right. The texture was different, softer, as though it was no longer solid. It felt like the wall was breathing. Suddenly, the faintest of whispers began to fill the room, so low that Sarah could barely make out the words. They came from all directions, swirling around her like 100 voices speaking at once. It was as if the very house itself was alive, murmuring dark secrets, warnings, and promises she couldn't quite understand. With trembling hands, Sarah managed to switch on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in front of her. The faint yellow light revealed the room, but everything seemed distorted. The corners of the room looked deeper, more shadowed, and Emily's dolls appeared to have moved, just slightly, as if they were no longer where they had been moments ago. She swung the flashlight back toward Emily, but the girl wasn't where she had been. In fact, she was no longer anywhere in sight. The air grew colder, and Sarah felt a shiver crawl up her spine. There was no way Emily could have moved that quickly. Sarah's mind raced, but before she could call out again, the whispers grew louder, sharper. "Get out!" The voice wasn't Emily's this time. It was low and guttural, and it felt like it was coming from inside her own head. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned in circles, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Leave the house. They're coming for you." Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone, scraping against the floor. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like nails on wood. A cold dread washed over Sarah as she turned toward the hallway, the flashlight's beam shaking in her hand. She was no longer sure where Emily had gone, or if she had even been in the room at all. But there was something else, something more urgent, more immediate. The scraping sound was closer now, moving toward her. It was growing louder, sharper. She backed up against the wall, heart pounding, eyes frantically scanning every inch of the room. Then she saw something. At the far end of the hallway, where the beam of light didn't quite reach, a shadow moved, a dark figure, tall and thin, its outline indistinct but unmistakable. "Who's there?" Sarah's voice cracked, panic setting in as she took another step back. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and every instinct told her to run, to flee from whatever was lurking just beyond her sight. But she couldn't move. Her legs felt frozen to the spot, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker still. The figure in the hallway took another step forward. It was moving slowly, almost deliberately, its long limbs twisted in ways that defied logic. Sarah could see it now, clearer than before. Its face, or what should have been a face, was pale and distorted, a grotesque mask of flesh that barely resembled a human being. Its eyes were wide and hollow, black pits that stared into Sarah's soul. The creature, whatever it was, didn't make a sound as it approached, but the oppressive weight in the air grew heavier, suffocating her with the knowledge that it was coming for her. And then, as if on cue, the light flickered again, and Sarah was plunged into complete darkness. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she swung the flashlight back and forth, but it was useless. The creature was gone. Emily was gone. The whispers, however, continued. "Leave. Now." Sarah forced her legs to move, ignoring the pounding in her chest, the terror clawing at her insides. She had to get out. She had to find Emily and leave the house before it was too late. She bolted for the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of dread. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Was this a prank? Was Emily playing some kind of cruel joke on her? But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. There was something in the house, something far worse than a child's imagination. Something that had been waiting. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the house. They were coming for her. She could feel it in her bones. "Emily," she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the thick darkness that surrounded her. "Emily, where are you?" She didn't know what she was expecting, but the reply she got was not from Emily. It was a voice, low and raspy, like something long dead, yet still clinging to life. "She's gone." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The voice didn't come from a person, it came from the walls. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She could hear it now, low, guttural, almost like a growl. The voice echoed, reverberating from the very walls around her, as if the house itself was alive, listening, watching. "She's gone," the voice repeated, more clearly this time. The words sent chills down her spine. Her hands trembled as she gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam flickering sporadically. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Sarah felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very air was thickening, suffocating her. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally, reaching toward her like tendrils of darkness. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, but desperate to understand. She couldn't make sense of anything that was happening. The house, the whispers, the things she couldn't see but knew were there. Everything was slipping beyond her grasp. just out of reach. Another sound, a scraping, low and slow, resonated through the floor beneath her feet. She flinched, turning in every direction, unable to pinpoint where it was coming from. A shadow moved across the wall in front of her, large and formless, shifting like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hardly hear the whispers anymore. But they were still there, faint, like a distant melody that wouldn't stop playing. "You're not welcome here," the voice continued, deeper this time, as if something much older and much darker, was speaking through the walls, through the house. "You should never have come." Sarah took a step back, her mind racing as the cold around her intensified. She needed to leave. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stay another second. But as her foot lifted, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, a single, sharp sound that made her jump. The house groaned as if it were coming to life. The stairs, dark and threatening, seemed to stretch upward endlessly. They loomed like a barrier between her and freedom. Sarah couldn't move. Her legs were shaking, rooted to the spot by an invisible force. The voice, so strange, so alien, seemed to be coming from everywhere, from all directions. "Don't look!" It was a warning. But Sarah couldn't help herself. She turned her head toward the stairs, her eyes straining to see. And there she was, Emily. The little girl was standing halfway up the staircase, her small body barely visible in the thick darkness. Her eyes, however, were wide open, too wide. Empty. Black. Her mouth stretched into a twisted smile, something far too unnatural to belong to a child. "Emily?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. The girl didn't move at first. She just stood there, staring at Sarah with those hollow eyes. But then, as if beckoned by some unseen force, Emily slowly began to move. She stepped down, one foot at a time, her movements jerky, unnatural. Every step creaked as if the very wood beneath her was protesting, trying to escape her. Emily stopped. Sarah cried, her voice breaking. She reached out, but the air felt heavy, thick with some dark force that kept her back, tethered in place. The girl continued to descend, her smile widening. "You shouldn't have come." Sarah felt the room begin to close in on her. The shadows grew longer, and the darkness seemed to swallow the very light around her, leaving only Emily's twisted silhouette. A cold hand gripped her heart. She could feel it now, the weight of something ancient and malicious, pressing against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. This wasn't a simple haunting. This was something far worse. The scraping sound began again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just from the walls anymore. It was coming from everywhere. From inside the house, from deep within the floors. It sounded like nails, claws, scraping against the surface, trying to break through. "Please," Sarah whispered, stepping backward. "Please, Emily, stop this. Whatever this is, it's not you." But the child didn't respond. Her mouth stretched even wider, her face contorting in ways that made Sarah's stomach churn. The eyes, they weren't Emily's eyes. They were dark, empty, voids of nothingness, staring into her very soul. "You're not real," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. She had to believe that. She had to. Emily wasn't like this. This wasn't her. But as the girl's foot came down with a sickening thud, it all started to make sense. Sarah's blood ran cold as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't Emily. The girl was an imitation. A thing. And it was here for her. "Get out!" The voice croaked again, now a cacophony of distorted sounds echoing throughout the house. Sarah's breath came faster. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body felt paralyzed, as if the very air in the room had turned to lead. "Leave," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just from the walls. It was behind her, right next to her. She could feel the cold breath against her neck, the sharpness of the words seeping into her skin. And then the lights flickered. The moment the light returned, Emily was gone. The stairs were empty, but Sarah knew she wasn't alone. Turning slowly, she faced the room behind her. The shadows had moved, had shifted. There was something in the corner, a dark figure, large and towering. It was just a silhouette, but Sarah could feel its presence, feel its malice in the air. She turned to flee, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. The room seemed to close in around her. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the air thick with a suffocating weight. Sarah backed away from the door, her heart racing in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tried to find the strength to scream, but the sound was lodged deep in her throat, choked by fear and the oppressive darkness. In the corner of the room, the figure remained, motionless but watching. Its shape was indistinct, a hulking presence that stretched far beyond the reach of the dim light. The air grew colder as the seconds dragged on, the silence amplifying the pounding of Sarah's heart in her ears. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. Desperately, Sarah scrambled for the door, her hands shaking as she gripped the knob. She twisted it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through her as she rattled the handle harder, her voice finally breaking free in a scream of frustration and terror. The figure in the corner remained still, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold and unblinking. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing in around her, and the walls, the very fabric of the room, seemed to pulse as if alive. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath quickening as something in the room shifted. The shadows seemed to twist and crawl, like dark tendrils reaching toward her. And then a voice. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't a child's voice at all. It was deep, guttural, and far too old. "Leave or be taken." The words slithered into her mind, curling around her thoughts like a serpent. The temperature dropped again, so cold it bit at her skin, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw something, a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, her flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows. Her panic rose higher, and she tried again, harder this time, to force the door open. She was shaking, her body trembling from the cold and the fear that clawed at her insides. The handle gave way with a sudden snap, the door creaking open, just a crack. But before she could pull it all the way open, a voice came again, this time closer behind her. "I told you to leave." The whisper was ice cold against her ear, and Sarah froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She felt the breath of whatever was behind her, its cold presence seeping into her skin, chilling her to the bone. Slowly she turned, her body moving against her will, as if some unseen force had control over her every motion. And there, standing in the doorway, was the child, Emily. Her face was twisted, her once innocent eyes now black as voids, empty and soulless. Her mouth was stretched unnaturally wide, showing sharp teeth, like a grotesque mockery of the little girl who had once lived here. "I told you." Emily's voice was no longer the sweet, high-pitched sound it had been before. It was deep, too deep, reverberating with an unnatural echo. "Now you're mine." Sarah screamed, her voice finally breaking free from her chest as she stumbled back, crashing into the wall behind her. But before she could move, the shadows lunged. They were everywhere, writhing, pulling at her, clawing at her skin. The dark shapes twisted around her, suffocating her with their weight. She fought, kicked, screamed, but it was no use. Her vision blurred as she was dragged into the darkness, deeper into the house, deeper into the horror that had been waiting for her all along. The last thing she saw before the world went black was Emily's smile. Twisted, jagged, unholy. The door slammed shut with a deafening crack. And then silence. Days passed. The house stood in eerie stillness, a quiet monument to the terror that had consumed Sarah. The lights flickered weakly as if barely clinging to life. The walls, once pristine, now bore marks of a struggle, scuffs, scratches, faint smudges of something darker, something not quite right. No one came for Sarah. No one would. Upstairs, in the same dark corner where Emily had stood, a faint whisper could be heard, almost like a lullaby, but twisted, distorted by time and darkness. And somewhere deep in the shadows, the house waited. For the next one. The house seemed to breathe. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, was a reminder of its presence. Its hunger. Weeks passed since Sarah vanished. The house, now desolate, had been abandoned by the few who dared to step near it. The neighbors whispered, told tales of the couple who had moved in, the strange occurrences that followed, and the chilling disappearance of the babysitter. But none of them knew the truth. None of them could see what was lurking inside, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The babysitter's disappearance had faded from memory, but the house remained, an ever-present reminder of the horror that it had consumed. Then one day the door creaked open again. A man stepped across the threshold, his figure silhouetted against the pale light filtering through the dust-covered windows. He was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that scanned the dark, oppressive space. His name was Mark, and he had come to investigate. A journalist, a seeker of stories, the kind who thrived on the unknown, the unexplained. He had heard the whispers, the rumors. A house that drove people mad. A house that ate the living. And now he was here, determined to get to the bottom of it. Mark pushed the door wide open, stepping cautiously into the hallway, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The house seemed to settle around him, groaning under the weight of its own darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of something stale, something long dead. Mark swallowed hard, his instincts telling him to leave, but his curiosity overpowered it. He wasn't afraid, at least not yet. His flashlight swept across the walls, illuminating the peeling paint and crumbling fixtures. Nothing seemed unusual, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Houses like these, old, forgotten places, had secrets, and Mark was determined to uncover them. The stairs loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. He hesitated for only a moment before ascending, each step creaking beneath his weight. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing faint smudges and fingerprints on the walls. As he reached the top, the air grew colder, heavier. He entered the first room he came across. The walls were bare except for the shadows that clung to every corner. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. Mark approached the center of the room, shining his light around, searching for something, anything, that would explain the mystery. And then he heard it. A soft rustling, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind the wall, as if something or someone was moving within it. His heart skipped a beat. Mark took a cautious step forward, his pulse quickening. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. He leaned in closer, pressing his ear to the cold, cracked surface of the wall. And then a whisper. "Help!" Mark recoiled, his flashlight dropping from his hand and rolling across the floor. The voice was barely audible, like a wisp of air, a breath caught in the silence. But it was real. He wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was behind the wall. His mind raced. Could it be Sarah? Could she have survived? Without thinking, Mark grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it into the wall. The force of the impact shook the house, sending dust and debris flying. The wall cracked open, revealing a small, narrow space behind it. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he stepped forward, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. The room was dark, the only light coming from his flashlight as it illuminated a small corner of the hidden space. And there, in the dim glow, he saw it. A figure. It was hunched over, crouched in the corner, its back turned to him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he slowly stepped forward, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. "Sarah," he called, his voice weak, unsure. The figure slowly turned around. It wasn't Sarah. The thing that stared back at him had no face. Its skin was stretched taut over a skull, as if its flesh had been pulled too tight. Its eyes were black voids, empty, as if they were staring into the very depths of his soul. Its mouth was wide, far too wide, a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth that seemed to stretch into infinity. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled, tripping over the rubble on the floor, his mind reeling. The thing tilted its head, as if it were studying him. Its mouth opened, and from within the darkness, the voice emerged. It was the same voice Mark had heard earlier, the one that whispered from the walls. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed. Mark turned and ran, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. His breath was ragged, his mind barely able to process the horror that he had just witnessed. He crashed through the hallway, fumbling for the door, but it wouldn't open. The house had closed in on him, trapped him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were alive, moving, swirling around him, pressing in from all sides. He could feel them closing in, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The shadows froze. The whispers stopped. And the house, its hunger, was satisfied, at least for now. Mark was never seen again. The house stood, empty and silent, waiting for the next person to wander too close. The walls once again were still, but the echoes, the voices, remained, and they would always be there waiting forever. The house stood like a tomb in the middle of the quiet neighborhood, its walls whispering in the dark. No one dared approach it anymore. The once pristine windows were now covered in layers of grime, the lawn overgrown with weeds that seemed to spread like tendrils, reaching toward anyone who might come near. The neighbors had long since avoided the house, crossing the street to avoid even glimpsing its darkened silhouette. But the house wasn't done. It never was. Weeks passed after Mark's disappearance, and the whispers surrounding the house grew louder. There were rumors, strange reports from those who had dared to live nearby. Some claimed to hear noises in the dead of night, muffled cries, the scratching of something large against the walls, or the creak of the front door opening and closing on its own. Others swore they had seen flickering lights in the windows, glimpses of shadowy figures moving in the dark. But no one ever came forward. The fear of the house was too great. And then one night, a moving truck arrived at the house. It was late, just after midnight, when the truck pulled up. The headlights cast long, eerie shadows across the yard, and the engine idled loudly in the silent night. A man, tall and thin, stepped out of the cab and glanced nervously at the house before entering the building. His name was David, and he was a real estate investor. The house had been repossessed and put on the market, and David had bought it cheaply, seeing an opportunity for a quick flip. He knew the rumors. He'd heard the whispers from the locals, but he didn't believe them. To him, it was just a house, albeit a strange one. He could make it work. With the right renovations, he'd make a fortune. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the porch light that seemed to flicker at random intervals. The door creaked open with a groan as David stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The walls seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect, and the floorboards creaked in protest as David walked through the hallway. He moved quickly, ignoring the unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. He was used to the anxiety that came with taking on new properties. This wasn't the first fixer-upper he had bought. As David moved deeper into the house, he passed the hallway where Mark had last been seen. There was nothing but silence, the kind that seemed to settle over a place like a thick blanket. His flashlight flickered as he passed, casting odd shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The air felt colder now, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. It was the kind of cold you felt when you were no longer alone in a room, the kind of cold that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. David tried to shake off the unease. He'd spent too many years in the business to let his nerves get the better of him. The house might be creepy, but it was still a house. He headed toward the stairs, deciding to start with the upper floors. The stairway creaked under his feet as he climbed, each step echoing through the emptiness. The air up here felt even heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. He shook his head, trying to focus on the task at hand. As he reached the top of the stairs, he turned down the hallway to his left. The rooms were dark, the windows covered in grime. But something was off. There was an odd warmth in the air, a presence that seemed to tug at his senses. His flashlight swept over the walls, revealing old wallpaper peeling from the corners. And then he saw it. A door. It was slightly ajar, the crack of darkness inviting him in. David felt a shiver run down his spine as he approached. Something in his gut told him to stay away, but curiosity won out. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, its walls lined with old furniture, the floor covered in dust. But it wasn't the room that caught David's attention. It was the wall. It was a hidden space behind the wall, just like in the stories. A narrow, secret compartment built into the structure of the house. His breath caught in his throat as he peered closer. There was something inside. It was dark, too dark, and the scent that wafted from the opening was foul, rancid. Without thinking, David reached forward, his hand trembling as he pushed aside the loose wood. The darkness seemed to consume him as he peered inside. There, in the cramped, confined space, lay a bundle of objects wrapped in old cloth. David reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold fabric. And then, the room went silent. For a moment, there was nothing. The air grew still, and even the floor beneath him seemed to stop moving. But then it happened. The bundle shifted. A low, guttural sound rumbled from within the walls, a growl that seemed to come from the very heart of the house. David froze. He felt something shift behind him. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, as if they were stretching toward him. He heard the faint sound of whispering, distant, yet so close it was as though the voices were right in his ear. It wasn't a sound anyone could ignore. It was a call, a beckoning. He turned, but it was too late. The thing in the wall, what he had thought to be merely a forgotten relic of the house, suddenly burst forward, a twisted mass of limbs, teeth, and shadow. It surged toward him, its eyes black, its mouth gaping wide, filled with rows upon rows of jagged teeth. David screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. As he was pulled into the blackness, the last thing he heard was the sound of the house whispering his name. And then silence. The house stood as it always had, quiet, waiting. As the days passed, the house settled back into its eerie calm. The silence that had overtaken the rooms felt almost suffocating, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. No one came to investigate David's disappearance. No one was ever meant to. The house had a way of keeping its secrets, of swallowing up any trace of those who dared uncover them. The neighbors had grown used to the strange happenings. They'd heard the rumors, of course, the mysterious disappearances, the flickering lights, the unsettling sounds coming from the house late at night, but they had all learned to ignore them. It was easier that way. It wasn't until the next morning that anyone noticed the van parked outside, its engine running in the cold morning air. A couple of young men, eager to make their mark in the renovation world, had decided to take a gamble on the house. They had no idea about David's fate, nor the truth of the house's dark past. To them, it was just another job, another fixer-upper waiting to be brought back to life. They were greeted by the same oppressive silence when they arrived at the house. The van's engine hummed in the cold air, its headlights casting long shadows across the yard as they unloaded their tools. The door creaked open as they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing through the dark hallway. One of the men, Jake, was the first to speak. "Weird place," he muttered, glancing around at the dust-covered furniture. "But the price was right. We'll fix it up in no time." His partner, Sam, nodded. "Yeah, but I've got a bad feeling about this place." "You feel it too, right?" Jake rolled his eyes. "You and your bad feelings. It's just a house, man. Let's get to work." They started moving through the lower floor, inspecting the rooms. The house was as they had expected, decaying, but full of potential. Old wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the wooden floors creaked under their weight, but it was nothing they couldn't fix. They split up, with Jake heading upstairs to check out the bedrooms while Sam started with the kitchen. But as Sam moved through the kitchen, he began to notice something off. The air felt heavy, as though it had been sealed off for years. The floor was slick, as if something had spilled and never been cleaned. He crouched down to examine it more closely, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. It was strange. The entire room had a feeling of neglect, as if it had been abandoned for far longer than the house's current state would suggest. Upstairs, Jake was moving through the rooms one by one, each more unsettling than the last. The air grew colder the higher he went, and every room seemed to have something wrong with it. As he stepped into what appeared to be a spare bedroom, he noticed something strange. An old dresser, its drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had left it in a hurry. He opened one of the drawers, only to find it empty except for a few scraps of paper. The paper was yellowed with age, but there was one word scribbled on it in dark ink. "Leave." Jake's heart skipped a beat as he glanced around the room, suddenly feeling very aware of how alone he was. A chill ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. The quiet of the house seemed oppressive now, as though it had closed in around him, sealing him in with its secrets. Meanwhile, Sam had moved into the basement, drawn by the strange sense that something was hidden down there. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, and the temperature dropped the lower he went. The basement was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, its light flickering erratically as if struggling to stay on. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. But it wasn't the smell that caught Sam's attention. It was the sound, a faint scratching noise, like nails dragging across the floor. It was so subtle, he almost thought he imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. His heart raced as he turned to face the darkened corner of the basement. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started. Sam stood frozen, listening to the silence. But there was something else now, something creeping up his spine, a feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of the light. And then he saw it, a pair of eyes, gleaming from the darkness. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he backed away slowly, his feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The eyes in the darkness followed his every movement, unblinking, cold. He turned and ran, his pulse pounding in his ears as he bolted up the stairs. Jake! Sam shouted, his voice shaking. Jake, we need to get out of here now. Jake appeared at the top of the stairs, looking disoriented. What is it? What happened? There's something down there, Sam gasped, his voice trembling. Something in the basement. I saw it. Those eyes. Jake didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted toward the front door, but as they reached it, something stopped them. The door wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door was stuck. It was as if the house itself had sealed them inside. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing, heavy and panicked. And then, the scratching began again. It was coming from the walls. Slow at first, like a distant whisper, but then louder, more insistent. As if something was trying to break through. Sam's eyes darted around, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. There's something in the walls, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Something's in the walls. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, desperate for an escape. But there was no way out. The house had them trapped. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside the walls was trying to claw its way out. The sound reverberated through the room, filling every corner of the house, making the air thick with tension. Sam and Jake exchanged terrified glances, their hands trembling as they clutched at the door handle, trying again to force it open. It wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the floorboards above them creaked. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, too slow to be human, echoed from the ceiling. Both men froze. Sam's heart was pounding in his chest, the fear creeping in deeper with each passing second. Jake stepped back, his breath shallow, eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of the impossible. What the hell is going on? Jake whispered, his voice a low rasp. Before Sam could respond, the room plunged into darkness. The light bulb flickered one final time before going out, leaving them in complete blackness. The silence was oppressive, a thick blanket that made every breath feel heavier, each second stretch out longer than the last. Sam's heart raced, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his hands slick as he reached for his phone in his pocket, desperate for even a sliver of light. But before he could turn on the flashlight, a low growl sounded from the dark. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. Sam froze, his entire body locking up in terror. He could feel it, that presence closing in on them. The growl was followed by the unmistakable sound of something skittering across the floor. Too fast to be a human, but with a speed that felt almost unnatural. Without thinking, Sam reached for Jake's arm, his fingers gripping tight. We need to move now. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something was pressing in on them from all sides. The scratching sound resumed, now closer, almost as if it were directly beneath them. Something was moving in the walls. But it wasn't just inside the walls. It was under the house, too. The ground beneath them trembled, and Sam felt the unsettling sensation of the floor shifting, as if the house itself were alive. Then, the footsteps began again. But this time they were closer, much closer. A low hiss filled the air, and Sam's blood ran cold as he turned his head slowly toward the source of the sound. There, in the blackness, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its body seemed to blend with the shadows around it, moving unnaturally, as if it were both part of the dark and completely separate from it. Sam couldn't make out its face. It had none. But its eyes, those eyes were bright, glowing in the dark, two orbs of sickly yellow light that bored into him, sending a chill down his spine. It was standing in the doorway, blocking their only exit, just beyond the reach of their desperate hands. Jake's voice broke through the silence, trembling. "Sam, what is that? What the hell is that?" Sam could hardly find the words. His mouth was dry, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now. He turned back to the door, and to his relief, the handle turned. With a violent push, the door swung open, revealing the dimly lit hallway outside. But the figure didn't move. It stayed where it was, its glowing eyes following their every movement. Sam's heart hammered in his chest as he grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him into the hallway, practically dragging him along as they stumbled toward the stairs. Behind them, the growl grew louder. They didn't look back. The stairs felt endless as they raced down, the footsteps of the creature above them following at a steady pace. Sam's breath came in ragged gasps as they reached the first floor, but the door to the outside, what should have been their salvation, was locked. It was no use. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard Sam twisted the handle, the damn thing wouldn't move. "We're trapped," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're trapped in here with it." Jake's eyes were wide with panic. "What do we do, Sam? What do we do?" The sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder again, closer now, as if it were right on top of them. Sam's mind raced for a solution, any solution, but there was nothing but the oppressive silence and the unnatural presence creeping closer. Suddenly there was a crash. The wall next to them exploded outward, splintering with a deafening sound. The force of the impact sent Sam and Jake stumbling backward, but it didn't matter. What emerged from the hole in the wall wasn't human. It was tall, its skin an unnatural shade of pale gray, stretched tightly over its thin, skeletal frame. Its long, elongated limbs twitched unnervingly, and its mouth hung open in a gaping grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The creature's eyes gleamed in the darkness, and it stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. It reached out toward them with one long, bony hand, the claws at the end of its fingers glinting in the faint light. Sam and Jake didn't have time to react. The creature lunged. In a blur of motion, Sam and Jake were both thrown to the ground, their screams cut off as the creature's claws raked across the floor, tearing through the air with a bone-chilling screech. It didn't seem to care that they were humans. It didn't seem to care about anything at all. It was hungry, and it was hunting. Sam barely had time to register the pain before everything went dark. And then silence. The creature didn't move again. The house, its walls, its secrets, and the dark figure that had haunted it for so long stood still, waiting for the next chapter to unfold, ready to consume whatever came next. In the end, there was only one certainty. There was no escaping the house. The air in the house seemed to thicken, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for the next victim to come stumbling into its web. Time became irrelevant, as if the very structure of the building had been suspended in a nightmare. Sam's body was heavy, his consciousness flickering in and out like a dimming light bulb, and every time he tried to open his eyes, the world around him seemed to shift in unnatural ways. His muscles ached, and he could feel the rawness of his wounds, but he couldn't quite place where the pain was coming from. His body felt alien, disconnected. When he finally managed to stir, he found himself lying in the dark, face pressed against something cold and damp. He was still on the floor of the apartment, but the room felt even more suffocating than before. His limbs were heavy, and for a moment, he thought that he might still be trapped in some sort of endless dream. He forced his eyes open again, blinking away the blackness. The room around him was eerily quiet. The growls, the hissing, the maddening scratching, everything had stopped. The air felt unnervingly still, and Sam's breath was ragged as he shifted his weight to sit up. That's when he saw it. The dark figure. The one that had been in the doorway before. It was standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the dim light. Its tall, twisted form was no longer just a shadow but something more solid, something that existed outside of Sam's comprehension. Its featureless face stared back at him with glowing eyes, silent, still, and unmoving. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, a desperate need to run rising within him, but his body felt paralyzed. His mind screamed, telling him to move, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He had no choice but to stare into the hollow eyes of the creature, those luminous orbs of sickly yellow that seemed to burn into his soul. Suddenly, a whisper sliced through the silence. The voice was faint but unmistakable, a slow, raspy hiss that echoed all around him. The words were indistinguishable at first, too quiet, too garbled, but then they became clear, each syllable dripping with malice. "You should have left long ago." The words reverberated through the walls, sinking into his very bones. Sam tried to look away, but the creature's gaze held him in place, unblinking and unyielding. "Leave or join us." There was a strange compulsion, an overwhelming urge to obey, and for a moment, Sam felt himself giving in. But then, as quickly as the sensation came, it vanished. He tore his eyes away, gasping for breath, his heart racing. He had to escape. He couldn't let it take him. He dragged himself to his feet, each movement slow and deliberate, as if every inch of progress was a battle. His body screamed in pain, and his vision was blurry, but he forced himself to stagger toward the door. It wouldn't open. Sam twisted the knob with frantic desperation, but it was no use. The door was stuck, locked tight. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and panic set in once again. There was no escape. Not through the door, not through the windows. He was trapped. The figure in the corner shifted then, its form undulating, as though the darkness itself was shaping it. Sam couldn't tell if it was getting closer or if he was simply being drawn toward it, but he could feel it, feel the pull of its presence deep in his chest. His breath quickened, and his legs trembled as he backed away, not daring to take his eyes off the creature. Why won't you leave?" Sam whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. The question escaped before he even realized he had asked it. The creature seemed to tilt its head, as if considering the question. Then it spoke again, but this time, the voice was not just in his ears, it was in his mind. "We are the house, the walls, the bones, the blood. You're a part of it now." Its words cut into Sam's very being, and he felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. The creature wasn't just part of the house. It was the house itself, and whatever had happened here, whatever horrors had taken place, had now become a part of him. Sam realized in that moment that he wasn't just trapped in the apartment. He was becoming part of it. He staggered backward, choking on a scream that would not come. The darkness seemed to close in on him, the walls pushing inward as if they were alive. The floors groaned beneath him, the wood shifting and creaking as if something vast and insidious were moving through the building. And then from the darkness another voice joined in, this one familiar, yet twisted in ways Sam couldn't comprehend. Sam. It was Jake. His friend, his partner in this nightmare, was speaking to him, calling out from somewhere in the dark. "Jake!" Sam shouted, his voice raw and desperate. "Jake, where are you?" There was no reply, just the sound of scraping, a whispering, and then a dreadful silence. But Sam felt the presence of Jake, somewhere, just out of reach. Somewhere, deep within the walls. And then, as if in answer, the walls themselves seemed to pulse, to breathe, as though something deep inside them was alive and aware. The apartment groaned with an unnatural vibration, as though the house was resonating with something ancient and hungry. The creature moved closer. "No one leaves," it whispered. "Not once you've come." Sam felt the cold embrace of hopelessness wrap around him, suffocating him, and he realized with absolute clarity that he would never leave. The house had claimed him, body and soul, and there was no escape from its dark grip. The lights flickered once more, casting one last moment of illumination before the darkness consumed everything. And as Sam's vision faded, he could almost hear the faintest echo of voices, of past victims, of forgotten souls trapped within the walls, murmuring their own tales of torment. The house would never be empty again. The world around Sam began to blur, the walls of the apartment dissolving into shadows. His body seemed to float, no longer tethered to the cold wooden floor. The darkness, thick and suffocating, wrapped around him like a suffocating cloak, pulling him deeper into the very heart of the house. It felt as though time had stopped altogether, and yet Sam could still hear the faint, distant whisper of the creature, its voice curling through the air, its presence lingering just beyond the edges of his consciousness. It was everywhere, and it was nowhere, a part of the house, a part of the walls, a part of everything that he had once known. "Sam! Sam!" The whisper came again, this time softer, more insistent. It was Jake's voice, but it no longer sounded like the friend Sam had known. It was hollow, distant, as though the words were being spoken from a place beyond the physical world. Sam tried to call out, to answer, but his voice was lost in the sea of darkness. His body was no longer his own. He was simply a part of the building now, a mere echo in the vast expanse of the house's ancient, malevolent structure. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like a beating heart, growing louder and louder until it reverberated through every bone in his body. It was as if the house itself was breathing, alive with something dark, something that could not be understood. And then, a strange sensation crawled over him, like fingers scraping across his skin. Sam's breath hitched as he realized that he could no longer feel his body in the same way. The space around him seemed to bend, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw flashes of memories, snippets of his life, flashes of laughter and warmth. But they quickly faded, drowned by the overwhelming presence of the house. Suddenly the walls shifted. A loud groan echoed through the apartment, a sound of something ancient, something powerful stirring deep within the structure. Sam's mind, fractured and delirious, caught a glimpse of something horrifying. Shapes, fleeting figures in the dark, twisting, contorting as if they were not meant to exist. He saw faces, twisted, grotesque faces, their eyes wide and glassy, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached out, their hands scraping against the walls, trying to break free. It was then that Sam understood. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a tomb for the lost souls that had once lived here, trapped for eternity in the bones of the building. The faces were the remnants of those who had come before him, drawn into the same dark fate, doomed to wander the halls, to suffer in the shadows. And now, Sam was one of them. The pulse of the house grew stronger, louder. He could feel the darkness pressing against him, suffocating him, drowning him in its cold embrace. His thoughts scrambled, unable to focus on anything but the overwhelming presence that surrounded him. But then, just as he thought he might be consumed completely, a flicker of light broke through the darkness. A single light bulb, hanging from the ceiling, flickered to life. The room was bathed in a soft, ghostly glow. For a brief moment, the shadows receded, and Sam could see the apartment once more. The walls were cracked and chipped, the floor covered in dust and debris, but there was something else, something new, something familiar. In the corner of the room, the figure of Jake stood. His body was slumped, his face pale and hollow, but his eyes, they were wide, frantic, as if he were still alive, still struggling to escape. "Sam," Jake's voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a low, strained cry. "Sam, we can still get out. We can leave, together." But Sam knew better. He knew there was no escaping. The house had already claimed them both. They were part of it now, lost in the web of darkness and suffering. "Jake!" "It's too late," Sam's voice trembled, his words barely a whisper. "We're part of it now. There's no leaving." Jake's form flickered, his figure shifting and warping like a reflection in broken glass. He reached out, his hand trembling, but before Sam could react, the light flickered once more, and Jake was gone, vanished into the darkness. The air grew still once more. The pulse of the house slowed, and Sam's mind began to fray at the edges. The darkness closed in around him, suffocating, consuming, and he could feel his very existence slipping away. As the final remnants of his consciousness faded, Sam realized the truth. The house didn't just trap people. It fed on them. It consumed their fear, their pain, their memories. It absorbed them, turning them into echoes of their former selves, lost in the walls, forgotten by time, doomed to roam the endless halls for eternity. And now, Sam was one of them. His voice, his face, his presence, lost to the darkness, forever a part of the house's twisted, insatiable hunger. The silence that followed was deafening. The very air seemed thick, as if it had been pressed into place by some invisible hand. Sam's consciousness lingered at the edges of awareness, trapped in a place that no longer resembled anything he had ever known. It wasn't the apartment anymore. It wasn't anything at all. He could no longer remember how long he had been lost in this space between reality and oblivion. Time had no meaning here, just an endless stretch of darkness and the distant echoes of forgotten lives. Then, like a single note in a forgotten song, something stirred within the void. A faint memory broke through the haze, fragmented, disjointed. It was the image of the old woman from the neighbor's apartment, the one who had warned him, the one who had known the truth. Her face had been weathered with age, but her eyes, they were sharp, filled with a knowing sorrow. "Don't let it get to you, boy," she had said, her voice low and trembling. "Once it knows you, once it has you, there's no escaping it." But Sam had ignored her. He had laughed it off, thinking it was just another paranoid rant. Now, in the suffocating darkness, those words came back to him, ringing in his ears like a final warning. Sam strained against the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though they had been weighed down by an unseen force. His thoughts were foggy, his senses dulled by the overwhelming presence that loomed over him. And then he felt it, a faint tug, a pull deep within his chest. It was the sensation of being drawn towards something far away, yet close. A whisper on the wind, a call that reached deep into his soul. It was the house. The building had recognized him. It had claimed him as its own. Suddenly, Sam was aware of the shift, of the subtle, creeping change in the air around him. The oppressive silence that had once surrounded him now felt charged, like the calm before a storm. The walls of the apartment, once distant and indifferent, now felt alive, as though they were watching him, waiting for him to move. And then, in a flash of clarity, Sam understood. The house wasn't just an inanimate structure. It was a sentient being, a malevolent force that had fed on the souls of its inhabitants for generations. It was a parasite, growing stronger with every life it consumed, feeding off fear, despair, and suffering. And now it had found him. The room around him began to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if the very walls were breathing. The darkness shifted, swirling like a living thing, closing in on Sam from all sides. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, of something old and forgotten, lingering in the corners of the room. In that moment, Sam realized that there was no escape. No matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he fought, the house would always be there, watching, waiting. The darkness began to form shapes, figures moving just beyond his sight, twisted and malformed. Faces, contorted in agony, flashed in and out of view, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the lost souls, the ones who had come before him, all trapped within the house's walls, doomed to wander for eternity. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the weight of their gaze upon him, their eyes piercing through him, tearing at the very fabric of his being. He could hear their whispers, their voices overlapping, a cacophony of desperation and pain. "You can't leave. You'll never leave." The words echoed in his mind, a mantra that seemed to reverberate through his entire body. The house had claimed him, and it would never let him go. But there was one thing Sam could still do. He reached deep within himself, searching for the strength to fight back, to resist. The darkness was all-consuming, but somewhere within the depths of his mind, he found a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that refused to be extinguished. With a guttural scream, Sam pushed against the darkness. His body trembled with the effort, his heart racing as he fought to hold on to the remnants of his sanity. The air around him grew thick with the oppressive weight of the house's hunger, but Sam refused to surrender. The figures in the darkness began to pull back, their forms flickering as if they were made of smoke, dissolving into the walls. The whispers grew fainter, more distant, as if the house itself was beginning to recoil from his resistance. For a brief moment, Sam felt the cold grip of the house loosen, and he dared to believe that he might be able to escape. But then the walls shuddered. The darkness roared to life, an overwhelming surge of energy that surged toward him like a tidal wave. The figures returned, swarming around him, their hands reaching out, their mouths contorting into grotesque shapes as they pulled him back into the depths of the house. And then, just as quickly as it had come, everything went still. The walls stopped pulsing, the figures faded into the darkness, and the whispers ceased. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized what had happened. He hadn't escaped. He had only delayed the inevitable. The house had consumed him, and now he was part of it. He could feel it inside him, inside his bones, inside his very soul. It had taken him, just as it had taken so many before him. And now he would wander the halls, lost in the darkness, a prisoner of the house for all eternity. Sam was no longer Sam. He was just another whisper in the walls, another lost soul trapped within the house's twisted, insatiable hunger. And the cycle would continue. The house would wait for its next victim, its next meal, and the echoes of Sam's existence would fade into the darkness, swallowed whole by the walls. The house was a dark entity, a twisted labyrinth of rooms and corridors that had been warped by centuries of torment. For Sam, it was now his only reality, a prison that stretched on forever. He had once been a living, breathing person, but that was no longer the case. His existence was a hollow echo in the vast expanse of the house. The darkness around him was thick, oppressive. It clung to the air like a cold mist, suffocating him with each breath he took. He could no longer feel the warmth of his own body, or the ache of hunger, or the pull of time. It was as if he had been erased from existence, and yet he remained, an indistinct shadow lost in a void that had no end. He tried to move, to stretch his limbs, but they felt foreign to him, like they belonged to someone else. It was as if the house had absorbed not just his body, but his very essence, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Sam's mind, however, was still intact, or at least that's what he thought. But even as his thoughts swirled, they began to feel disconnected from him. Memories that were once vivid and sharp, like the feeling of the sun on his face or the taste of food, now seemed like distant fragments of a life he could no longer touch. They were fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The house had taken everything from him, even his identity. He remembered the moment when he had first entered this place, the excitement of a new life in the apartment, the simple joy of a fresh start. He could recall the mundane, the moments of laughter and casual conversations with neighbors. But now all of that was gone, swallowed whole by the house. And still he lingered. Suddenly a chill swept through the air, sharp and biting. It pierced the quiet, stirring something deep within him. A spark, a flicker of recognition. He could hear it now. The sound that had always been there, but had eluded his awareness until this moment. It was the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Sam's heart, though it no longer beat, responded to the sound. It was a primal thing, a fear that had been buried deep within him, rising once again. He stood frozen, unable to move or react, trapped in the stillness of the room. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to echo off every surface, every corner, until they filled every inch of the space around him. There was no escape. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to grow denser, pressing in on him from all sides. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned. But it was a different silence now, a silence that buzzed with anticipation. Sam wanted to scream, to fight, but his voice had long since abandoned him. There was nothing left but the oppressive presence of the house, the suffocating force that weighed on his mind and soul. He could feel the house, aware of him, aware of his resistance. And then, through the haze of his consciousness, he saw it. A figure, or perhaps more accurately, the shape of a figure, shifting, flickering like a shadow in the corner of his mind. It was there, but not quite. It was both close and distant, just out of reach, its shape indecipherable, its form shifting in ways that made it impossible to focus on. It was the house, or something within it. Sam could feel it watching him, examining him, probing his every thought, every fragment of his being. It was curious, like a predator toying with its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. He tried to move again, to make some attempt at breaking free from the grip of the house, but his limbs refused to obey. He could only stand there, trapped in the dark, at the mercy of whatever force was pulling the strings. Then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, Sam understood. This wasn't just a house. It was a living thing, a creature born of darkness, feeding on the souls of those unfortunate enough to cross its threshold. It had been here long before Sam, and it would remain long after. It had existed for centuries, stretching back to the very foundations of the building, and it would continue to exist for as long as the walls stood. It didn't need to feed on physical bodies. It fed on fear, on souls, on the very essence of those trapped within its grasp. The house was a predator, and Sam was now just another casualty, another victim to be consumed, another whisper in the walls. But there was one thing the house didn't anticipate. A surge of willpower, however faint, broke through the suffocating despair that had taken hold of him. It was a tiny spark, a glimmer of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Sam's mind, though weakened, still retained a shred of clarity, a fragment of his former self. The house might have claimed his body, his voice, his identity, but it had not claimed his will. Sam's thoughts were no longer his own, but he could still control them. He focused on the one thing that remained to him, his desire to escape, his refusal to be another lost soul in this endless, suffocating darkness. For the first time since he had entered the house, he made a move. It was slow at first, his limbs heavy and unresponsive, but as he concentrated harder, the darkness seemed to recoil, ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A footstep. He took another step, and then another. The air around him began to shift. The oppressive presence of the house seemed to fade, just for a moment. The walls, once looming and suffocating, seemed to shrink back. Sam's breath, his first breath in what felt like an eternity, was shallow, quick. But he had to keep moving. He couldn't stop. The house might be weakened, but it would not let him go easily. And so he moved, step by step, through the dark, through the suffocating silence, hoping against hope that the house would let him escape. But the deeper he moved, the darker it became. The footsteps, once distant, were now at his heels. The house wasn't done with him yet. The hunt had only just begun. The walls seemed to stretch and contract, like the house itself was breathing, pulsing with a life of its own. The footsteps behind him grew louder, sharper, like the rapid tapping of nails against the floor, echoing in the hollow emptiness. Sam quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his chest, even though he could no longer feel it physically. The oppressive air around him thickened with each step, pressing down on him as if the house itself were trying to suffocate him, drag him back into its grasp. He stumbled, but managed to steady himself, his eyes straining in the darkness for any sign of an exit. The hallway before him was endless, the walls narrowing until it felt like he was walking through a tunnel. He could sense something ahead, a shift in the air, a subtle movement that made his skin prickle. It was faint at first, but the deeper he ventured, the more tangible it became. The presence was watching him. Sam could feel the eyes of the house upon him, creeping over every inch of his being, as if the walls themselves had turned into eyes, observing his every move, waiting for him to slip. He gritted his teeth, resisting the overwhelming urge to turn back. There was no turning back. His mind raced, his thoughts fragmented as they fought for coherence. He tried to focus, to remember something, anything, that could guide him out of this nightmare. But the memories were slipping like sand through his fingers. He couldn't even remember how long he had been trapped in the house. Days? Weeks? Time had ceased to exist. All he knew was the crushing darkness, the weight of it pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Then, as if a signal had been given, the darkness around him began to shift. The silence was broken by the sound of something scraping against the floor, dragging, like claws running along the wood. The sound was close now, too close, and Sam's pulse spiked in terror. He had to get away. He had to run. But his legs refused to obey. His body, exhausted and broken, seemed to rebel against him, slowing his every movement. It was as if the house itself was pulling at his limbs, refusing to let him escape. He stumbled forward, breath coming in ragged gasps. The scraping grew louder, more persistent. He could feel it now. Whatever was in the dark with him, hunting him, was drawing closer. Every instinct screamed at him to run faster, to fight, but the house was in control. The house was the predator, and he was its prey. Then, in a flash of horror, Sam realized something chilling. He was not alone in the hallway. A shape, black as pitch, moved in the shadows ahead. It was fleeting, a mere silhouette, but it was there. The shape shifted, its movements fluid and unnatural, like something that did not belong. It was coming for him, its form stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic, defied reason. It was like the darkness itself had taken shape, a creature formed from the very fabric of the house. The sound of its claws scraping against the floor grew louder. Closer. Sam's breath caught in his throat as panic surged through him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The oppressive silence crushed any hope of calling for help, of reaching out to anyone beyond the walls of this accursed place. With one final desperate push, he forced his legs to move, to carry him forward, to escape whatever horror was waiting behind him. The walls seemed to close in around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. The hallway stretched on forever, an endless maze of darkness and terror. And then, through the oppressive gloom, he saw something. A door. It was small and unremarkable, like every other door in the house, but it was different. It beckoned to him, an escape from the nightmare that had been consuming him. His heart thundered in his chest as he reached for the door, desperate to break free, to find some kind of salvation. But as his hand touched the handle, the door swung open, and he was met with nothing. The room beyond was a void, an empty, endless space that seemed to stretch into infinity. There were no walls, no floors, no ceiling, just the dark, oppressive nothingness. It was as if the door had opened into a place beyond time and reality, a place that had no beginning or end. Sam hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Was this the escape he had been seeking? Or was it just another trick of the house, a lure to pull him deeper into its grasp? He stepped forward. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Sam spun around, but it was already too late. The room he had entered was not empty. It was not nothingness. It was filled with eyes. Hundreds, thousands of eyes stared at him from the darkness, their hollow gazes unblinking, unfeeling. They were everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around him. The eyes shifted, moving as if they were alive, tracking his every movement, watching him with an unholy intensity. And then he saw it. The shape. The thing that had been following him, hunting him. It was no longer a shadow. It was standing before him, a grotesque, twisted creature made of darkness and flesh. Its body was malformed, its limbs long and jagged, as if it had been twisted and broken by the house itself. Its face was a distorted mask of human features, eyes too large, a mouth too wide, a smile that stretched impossibly across its face. It was smiling at him. The thing reached out, its fingers long and spindly, claws scraping against the floor. Sam tried to move, tried to run, but his body was frozen, his limbs paralyzed with fear. The creature loomed closer, its breath foul and thick, its presence overwhelming. Sam could feel its touch, cold and clammy, as it reached out for him, its fingers brushing against his skin. And then, in a final, horrifying moment of clarity, Sam understood. The house wasn't just a trap. It wasn't just a predator. It was a parasite, feeding on fear, on the souls of those it trapped within its walls. It wasn't hunting him. It had already consumed him. Sam was no longer human. He was a part of the house now, a fragment of its endless hunger. And as the creature's claws closed around him, he was swallowed whole, his scream lost in the void, lost in the walls that would never stop echoing. The air was thick with silence, the oppressive weight of it hanging over the darkened room like a suffocating blanket. Sam's final moments echoed in his mind, a fractured memory lost in the abyss of the house. The eyes that had watched him, the monster that had consumed him. Everything felt distant now. The room, the hallway, the door, all of it had disappeared, swallowed by an unfathomable void. But the house was not done yet. Time seemed to stretch and bend within the walls. Outside, the world continued as it always had, indifferent to the nightmare unfolding within the darkened halls of the house. The sun rose and set, but here in this twisted domain, the concept of time no longer held meaning. The walls groaned and whispered, as if the house itself was alive, stirring from its deep slumber. It fed on fear, on the lives it devoured, and now, with Sam's disappearance, it hungered for more. In the distance, another door creaked open. The silence was shattered by the faintest sound, a soft shuffle of feet against the wooden floor. It was almost imperceptible at first, a mere whisper in the dark. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, like someone knew something was moving purposefully through the corridors of the house. The air shifted again, growing colder, heavier. The walls seemed to pulse with a quiet anticipation. The footsteps continued, moving with a purpose, a steady rhythm that sent chills crawling down the spine. They were not Sam's. They were different, almost mechanical in their precision. It was as if something else had entered the house, something that belonged there, something that had always been a part of its very foundation. The creature that had consumed Sam was no longer alone. The presence in the house had multiplied, and with each passing moment, the darkness spread further. The hallways stretched longer, twisting in ways they never had before. The room seemed to breathe, exhaling whispers that carried the scent of rot and decay. In the deepest recesses of the house, unseen hands reached out, beckoning, calling forth those who would answer. Another door opened, this time louder, more forceful. A figure stepped into the hallway, its silhouette casting an eerie shadow against the walls. The figure was small, but its presence was undeniable. Its movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like a marionette on the edge of collapse. But it wasn't a person, not in the traditional sense. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a twisted mockery of human features. It was like the house had given birth to a new thing, a child of the darkness, a creature born from its very marrow. It moved toward the center of the hallway, its empty eyes scanning the darkness, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. It wasn't searching for anything, it was waiting. Waiting for something to come to it, something to fall into its grasp. The air grew heavier still. The darkness closed in. And then from the shadows, the low hum of something ancient and malevolent, began to rise. The house was alive again. It had always been alive. And now it was hungry. As the creature in the hallway took another step forward, its long fingers brushing against the walls, the house groaned, a deep and echoing sound, as if it was awakening from a long slumber. The figure turned, its hollow eyes now fixed on the far end of the hallway. It knew what was coming. The darkness shifted again. Something else was emerging. Another door opened. The room beyond it was dark, but not empty. There were shapes within the shadows, figures that seemed to shift and move with unnatural speed. The thing that had taken Sam, was there watching. And it wasn't alone. A new presence entered the hall, its form a blur in the dim light. It was tall, its head scraping against the ceiling as it moved forward with impossible speed, its limbs elongated and unnatural. It wore the same twisted expression as the other creatures, an unsettling smile that stretched too wide to be human. It wasn't human. None of them were. They were the house's children, its creations. Twisted, warped things born from the very foundations of the place. They were its offspring, sent to feed, to hunt, to claim more souls and drag them into the dark. And they weren't stopping. The first figure, the one that had waited in the hallway, took a step toward the shadows, and as it did, the house responded. The walls groaned again, louder this time, and the darkness thickened. The temperature dropped as if the very air had frozen, suffocating every breath. Then, from the depths of the house, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, footsteps that belonged to something much, much older than any of them. Something that had waited for this moment. Something that had been waiting for Sam. The thing that had devoured him, rose from the shadows, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. It was bigger now, stronger, as if it had been nourished by the darkness of the house itself. It was coming, and the walls, the very house that had once seemed so quiet and innocent, were now alive with the promise of death. The creatures began to move, scattering through the corridors like insects, drawn toward the sound of the approaching presence. They had a purpose now, a singular mission to hunt. They would feed, and the house would grow stronger. In the end, it was never about the walls. It was never about the doors or the floors. It was always about what lay beneath, what had always been there, waiting, watching. The house. The house was the predator, and its hunger had only just begun. The house seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, the walls shifting and sighing with an unsettling sort of hunger. With each breath of the building, the air grew thicker, suffocating in its stillness. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, like the ticking of an ominous clock. Whatever ancient force had taken root here was stirring, awakening from its long dormancy. And now it was hunting. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, carrying the faintest echoes of movements just beyond sight. The shadows were alive, crawling along the floors, inching closer to their prey. The creatures, those twisted, malformed beings, had vanished into the darkened corridors, but their presence was still felt, thick and suffocating, like a weight pressing against the air. They were closing in, surrounding the house, waiting for the inevitable. And yet, the house itself was not finished. In the farthest reaches of the building, behind forgotten doors and hidden passageways, the true nature of the nightmare was unfolding. Deep within the bowels of the structure, where light had never touched, something began to stir. The first sound was soft, barely a whisper, a faint scraping of stone against stone. It was so quiet at first that it could have been mistaken for nothing more than the settling of the old building. But as the noise grew louder, it became clear. Something was moving, something large, something powerful. A figure emerged from the depths of the house, its outline indistinct, a blur of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was relishing the inevitable confrontation. It was a towering presence, its features concealed in shadow, but there was no mistaking the malice radiating from it. This thing had been here long before the creatures, long before Sam or any other soul had crossed its threshold. It had been waiting, and now it was hungry. The house groaned once more, the creaking of old wood and stone vibrating through the building. The presence, the force that had always lingered in the background, buried beneath the walls, was now making its way to the surface. It was drawing closer, its intentions clear. It was coming for them all. The creatures, the twisted offspring of the house, scattered in response to the growing power. They moved in a chaotic frenzy, drawn to the impending arrival of the true horror. Their distorted forms twisted and contorted, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of hunger and malice. They scurried through the darkness, fleeing from something far greater than themselves, something that held dominion over them. And then, in the deepest recesses of the house, the first scream was heard. It was a low, guttural cry that echoed through the walls, reverberating through every room, every corner of the building. It was a scream of anguish, of terror, a sound that carried the weight of centuries of suffering. The scream rang out again, louder this time, as though the house itself was crying in pain. And then the silence returned. The house seemed to settle, its breathing slow and measured once again, as if it was preparing for something. It was waiting for the next victim, the next soul to be drawn into its depths. The walls, once silent, now hummed with an unsettling energy, as if the house itself had become aware of its own power. It was not simply a structure. It was a living, breathing entity, capable of consuming all that dared to enter its domain. The creatures had all but disappeared, hiding in the corners, waiting, listening. But the true terror, the thing that had been lying dormant in the walls for so long, was not so easily deterred. It was coming, and nothing could stop it. In the darkest part of the house, the figure that had been waiting in the shadows emerged fully into view. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a fleeting presence. It was real, tangible, its form massive and looming, its features horrific and unknowable. Its body seemed to pulse with the same sickening rhythm as the walls, a twisted reflection of the house itself. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a piercing, otherworldly gleam that cut through the darkness like a knife. There was nothing human about it, nothing even remotely familiar. It was a thing that had existed long before the house had been built, a being born of the darkness that consumed everything in its path. It moved through the corridors with a grace that belied its monstrous size. The house, in all its eerie stillness, seemed to bow to its presence, the walls shifting to make room for it, the floors groaning under its weight. It was as though the building was giving itself to the creature, allowing it to pass through unhindered, to claim whatever it desired. And in its wake, the house seemed to tremble. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now buckled, as though they were afraid of the thing that walked within them. The floors cracked and splintered beneath its steps, the very foundation of the house beginning to crumble under the weight of its presence. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, as if the very earth beneath their feet was beginning to unravel. The house was not a sanctuary. It was a trap, and as the creature moved deeper into the building, the darkness began to spread. It was no longer contained within the walls. It spilled into the rooms, flooding them with a suffocating blackness that devoured everything in its path. The creatures, those twisted, malformed offspring, had long since been overwhelmed, consumed by the very force they had been born to serve. The house was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the creature now, and it was hungry. The footsteps of its approach grew louder, resonating through the empty halls. It was coming for them. It was coming for whoever remained. The house was alive, and it would never let them go. The silence was deafening now, oppressive in its stillness. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, the air so thick with dread it was nearly suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse, their once quiet creaks now amplified into an almost ominous rhythm, as though they were alive, watching, waiting, listening. There was no escape. The house, the walls, the very ground beneath them, none of it was safe. It was all part of something far darker, far more ancient than they could have ever imagined. The sound of footsteps echoed once more, this time followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was a voice, though not human, not even close. It was a low, guttural murmur, filled with malice, as if the very fabric of the house was speaking. It scraped at their minds, tugging at their sanity. A cold breeze stirred, not from the open windows or the cracked doors, but from within the walls themselves. It wasn't the simple chill of a draft. It was a bone-deep cold that seemed to come from the heart of the house, like a whisper from the abyss itself. Kate's heart hammered in her chest, her breath quickening as she clutched the flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, as though the walls themselves were reaching out to claim her. She could feel it now, the weight of the house pressing down on her. The sense of something unseen, something ancient, waiting for the right moment to strike. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the soft, sinister hum of the house, as if it were alive and listening. A crash echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against the walls. Kate's breath caught in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned slowly, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but her legs refused to move. The darkness seemed to swell around her, enveloping her in its cold embrace. She could hear it now, scratching, tapping, scraping, 1,000 unseen hands crawling through the walls like rats in a trap. There was no escape. She was trapped. The flashlight flickered, dimming, then brightening again. It was as though the very light in her hand was being fought, struggling to hold onto whatever sliver of power remained. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, the air growing colder still. Every inch of the space felt alive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. A door slammed shut somewhere in the distance, a sound so sharp it cut through the thick air like a knife. Kate jumped, her body instinctively jerking away from the noise, her heart racing as panic set in. She turned, scrambling for the hallway, but her feet felt leaden, heavy. Something was in the hall, something large. She could feel it, just beyond the reach of her flashlight's beam. In the distance, a figure materialized, its outline barely visible against the backdrop of darkness. It moved slowly, its steps deliberate, each one echoing through the house like the thud of a death sentence. The light flickered again, this time almost entirely dark. She was plunged into total blackness, save for the faintest outlines of the figure, its form growing clearer with every passing second. "Please," Kate whispered, her voice shaking. Her hand reached for the flashlight again, but it was gone, snatched from her grip as the shadows closed in. A cold breath brushed against the back of her neck, icy and unnatural. She turned, her pulse racing, but there was nothing there, nothing visible, only the silence. It was as though the darkness itself had grown arms, hands that reached for her with unseen fingers, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Her breath came in ragged gasps now, panic clawing at her throat. She could hear it, the soft whispers, the scratching sounds, the pulse of something ancient and hungry. It was closer now. She could feel it, the weight of its presence, pressing down on her chest. It was behind her, beside her, everywhere. She dared not turn around again, but the sounds grew louder, the whispers clearer. "You shouldn't have stayed." The voice was low, guttural, a rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate in her skull. It wasn't human, no, not human at all. It was a thing, something that belonged to the darkness, a presence that had been here long before she ever stepped into this house. The walls creaked again, but this time it wasn't just the house settling. It was something else, something far more insidious. The walls seemed to shift, the space narrowing, trapping her in a corner with nowhere to go. The figure was closing in, its steps slower now, more deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Kate's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of panic and terror. What had she gotten herself into? She had no idea what this thing was, no idea what it wanted. All she knew was that it wasn't human, and it was coming for her. There was only one choice: fight or flee. She backed into the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. The room was closing in on her, the walls pressing inward, as though the house itself were preparing to swallow her whole. And then, just as the figure was nearly upon her, there was a shift, a sudden crack of light, a sudden spark of hope. The power flickered back on, the lights above her dimly buzzing, and she saw it. The thing standing before her was not just a figure in the dark. It was a grotesque, nightmarish creature, its features half hidden in shadows, its twisted limbs contorted in ways that should have been impossible. Its eyes gleamed like black pits, endless voids that pulled her in, threatening to devour her entire being. Before she could react, the darkness closed in again, and the creature reached for her, its fingers cold and sharp. In the final moment, she screamed. And then there was nothing. The house fell silent again. The lights flickered back to life, casting harsh, fluorescent light across the room. The air felt thick with the remnants of something terrible, lingering in the shadows, waiting. But Kate was gone. The walls were still, as though they had never moved. The once creaking timbers were now utterly still, as though the house had exhaled a long, pent-up breath. All that remained was the echo of her scream, fading until it was no more than a faint memory. Upstairs, the other residents, neighbors who had been living in the building for years, had felt the power surge, had heard the faint rumblings from below, but they were none the wiser. The house continued to hum with a life of its own, as if mocking those who dared to call it home. But something was different now. The walls, once hiding dark secrets, now seemed to reveal just enough to whisper to the inhabitants. They weren't alone. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ellis, wandered the halls late at night, struggling with her sleep, her mind disturbed by what she had heard from Kate's apartment. She had often wondered about the strange occurrences, but never dared to look too closely. But tonight, something had changed, something she couldn't explain. The smell of decay lingered in the hallway, though the air was fresh in every other room. The smell of old furniture mixed with something that reminded her of wet earth. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to pulse with a faint rhythm, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. She tried to ignore it, brushing off the thoughts as just a passing imagination. But then she heard something. A voice. "Help! Help me!" The voice was faint, soft, as though it came from within the very walls themselves. Mrs. Ellis froze in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard that voice before, many years ago in her youth. It was a voice she could never forget. It was her daughter's. Her heart raced. She could feel the blood drain from her face as the world around her grew darker. Her legs trembled, unwilling to carry her, but she forced herself to move, following the voice that called to her, growing fainter as she drew nearer. The walls seemed to close in around her, the familiar hallway twisting, contorting as though mocking her attempts to escape. At the end of the hall, she stopped. There was a door slightly ajar, a sliver of dark space beckoning her closer. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, but she couldn't stop herself. The voice was calling again, urging her forward. "Please don't leave me." Her fingers closed around the doorknob, cold as ice, and she pushed the door open. The room was dark, empty, save for the strange light emanating from the walls, glowing faintly with an otherworldly hue. The shadows twisted and danced like they had a life of their own. And in the corner, something moved. Her heart leapt into her throat as she took a cautious step forward. There, huddled in the corner, was a small, shadowy figure. A child, but not one she recognized. It was too still, too silent, its eyes staring out from the darkness. "Who are you?" Mrs. Ellis whispered, her voice hoarse. The child didn't respond. It simply stood there, unblinking, as if waiting for something, waiting for her. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and she felt a wave of nausea crash over her. Her vision blurred, her head spinning as the walls began to close in. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of something far older than her, than the building itself. Something ancient had woken, something that never should have been disturbed. The child's eyes blinked. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it opened its mouth. But instead of a voice, there was only a whisper that felt like a hand closing around her throat. "Get out!" The words were clear, but they didn't come from the child's mouth. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very foundation of the house. Mrs. Ellis stumbled backward, gasping for air, her legs giving way beneath her. Her vision swam, and her thoughts grew hazy. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mind was unraveling, torn between what was real and what was not, unable to tell if she was still standing or if she was lost in the darkness forever. In that moment, the walls shifted again, revealing what lay beyond the child. There, in the deepest part of the room, was a dark, gaping hole, an opening that had not been there before. A black void, like the entrance to a forgotten tomb, calling her toward it with a magnetic pull. And then, in the blink of an eye, the child was gone. The room fell silent. Mrs. Ellis was alone, trembling, unable to process what she had just witnessed. The whispers grew louder now, the walls vibrating as if alive, as if the house itself had become something sentient, something hungry, something that had been waiting. With one final agonizing breath, Mrs. Ellis turned and fled the room, but as she passed through the door, she realized, too late, that it wasn't just the house that was waiting for her. It was the dark thing in the walls, and it wasn't letting her leave. The final sound was the creaking of the walls, like bones breaking, as the house shifted once more. But this time there was no escape. The walls groaned, and the sound seemed to reverberate through the very core of the building. Mrs. Ellis stumbled down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was pressing in on her. Her mind screamed at her to escape, to run, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen, caught in the grip of something far older, far darker than she could ever comprehend. The walls around her seemed to close in, their surfaces rippling with an unsettling life of their own. She reached the stairwell, her hand gripping the railing for support, but the stairway seemed impossibly long, as though it stretched on forever. Every time she looked down, the steps seemed to shift, twisting and contorting as if mocking her desperate attempts to flee. A distant, guttural noise echoed from below, a low, growling rumble that seemed to come from the very depths of the building. It was the sound of something waiting, something hungry. Mrs. Ellis felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She tried to scream again, but the sound was lost in the suffocating silence of the building. The air felt thick with the weight of impending doom. Her mind flashed back to her daughter's voice, the voice that had called to her from the walls, the voice she had heard so many years ago. The child in the corner, her daughter's voice had been the same, but the figure had not been her daughter. It had been something else, something that had been hiding in the walls, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Mrs. Ellis's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the stairs, gasping for breath. Her body shook with fear, but she couldn't stop herself. The building had taken hold of her, and there was no escape. As she sat there, trembling, the whispering began again. This time it wasn't just one voice, it was many voices, layered on top of each other, all speaking at once. The walls were alive with the sound. The very fabric of the building seemed to hum with malevolent energy. Leave, leave, or stay, stay forever. The words were incomprehensible, but they were clear in their meaning. The house was giving her a choice: leave and never return, or stay and become part of it forever. The decision was hers to make, but the weight of it was unbearable. Mrs. Ellis tried to stand, but her legs were like jelly, her body refusing to cooperate. She could feel the darkness closing in on her, could feel the cold, oppressive presence of whatever had taken residence in the walls. It was everywhere now, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She could hear it, feel it, taste it in the air. The walls were alive, and they wanted her. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the building's dark energy. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She was surrounded, trapped. "Please help me," she whispered, but there was no one left to hear. In the distance, she could hear the sound of footsteps. Faint at first, then growing louder, drawing nearer. Her pulse quickened. Was someone else still in the building? Was it another resident, trapped like she was? Or was it something else? The footsteps stopped just behind her. Mrs. Ellis turned slowly, her heart in her throat. But when she looked up, she saw nothing. The stairwell was empty. There was no one there. But the feeling of being watched never left her. It was as though the building itself was staring at her, watching her every move. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the walls seemed to grow closer, suffocating her. The air was thick with dread, and she knew deep down, in the pit of her stomach, that there was no escaping. Something was coming. She turned back to the stairs, but the steps were now a blur. They twisted and warped before her eyes, stretching out impossibly long, as if the building itself was shifting, rearranging, closing in around her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all demanding her attention. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The voices were in her mind now, twisting her thoughts, making her question what was real and what was imagined. The walls were closing in. She could feel them, feel the weight of the building pressing down on her. The floor beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every passing second. Then, in the darkness, something moved. It was a shadow at first, a flicker in the corner of her eye. But then it grew, taking shape, becoming something more. The shape of a figure, standing in the darkness, just out of reach. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was, who it was. The figure in the shadows was familiar. She knew it. It was her daughter. But no, it wasn't her daughter. The figure's eyes were wide and unblinking, empty black pits that seemed to stare straight through her. It was not human. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for years, biding its time, hidden within the walls. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow echo. Mrs. Ellis tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, her lungs burning for air. The darkness closed in around her, and she could feel the cold breath of the thing in the shadows, feel it inching closer with every passing second. Then, everything went dark. The last thing she felt was the cold, clammy grip of the thing's hand on her shoulder. And then nothing. The house stood silent, the whispers fading away as if they had never been. The walls returned to their still, oppressive quiet. The building seemed to breathe again, its pulse slow and steady, as though it had never been disturbed. But deep within the walls, the thing was waiting. Waiting for the next visitor to stumble into its grasp. The days passed, and the house remained eerily silent, as if nothing had happened. The city outside continued its rhythm, unaware of the horrors that had taken place behind the walls of the old house on Maple Street. The building had claimed another soul, but it was only a matter of time before someone else would wander into its grasp. A young couple, drawn by the allure of an affordable place to live in the increasingly expensive city, found the house on Maple Street through a real estate agent who had been eager to show them something unique. They were new to the area, excited for the prospect of settling into a home that seemed full of character. The house was spacious, with high ceilings and rooms that whispered of old history. Its slightly decaying charm made it seem like a perfect project for the couple. When they first stepped inside, they felt the weight of the house's history pressing against them, but they dismissed it as nothing more than the building's age. The real estate agent mentioned that it had been vacant for years, but that there had once been a family living there, before things took a strange turn. The agent had insisted it was all nothing more than rumors and small-town gossip. The couple was charmed by the house's potential and its vintage fixtures. They eagerly moved in, excited to transform it into a home of their own. At first, the renovations were easy. They painted the walls, polished the wooden floors, and took pride in restoring the house to its former glory. Yet, as the days wore on, they began to notice strange occurrences that no amount of fresh paint could explain. It started small, unexplained noises in the walls at night, like scratching, scurrying, and faint whispers that couldn't be identified. At first, they shrugged it off, blaming it on old plumbing or the creaks of an ancient house settling. But then the noises grew louder, more deliberate, as if something, or someone, was trying to get their attention. One night, after a particularly late renovation session, the couple was sitting on the couch in their newly furnished living room, staring at the walls, exhausted. The lights flickered. It was brief, no more than a moment, but long enough to make them both look at each other. The air in the room felt suddenly cold, and an eerie tension seemed to seep from the walls. "What was that?" the woman asked, her voice soft. "Probably just the lights," her husband replied, but his tone was unconvincing. "It's an old house." But as the night wore on, the air grew colder, and the sounds in the walls became harder to ignore. The couple's sleep was interrupted by the scratching noises, the whispering voices that seemed to echo from every corner. They grew restless, their nerves fraying as the house seemed to come alive with activity at night. The final straw came one evening when the woman was unpacking boxes in the attic alone. The room had been untouched for years, a dusty collection of forgotten objects and furniture. As she shifted through boxes, she stumbled across an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Curiosity piqued, she opened it, flipping through the faded pages until something stopped her. The writing was difficult to read, scrawled hastily, but the last entry stood out. "The walls are closing in. We can hear them in the walls, always watching. We can't leave. They know we're here. Don't let them find you. Don't listen to them. They take what they want, and then you're never heard from again." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she read the chilling words, her heart racing in her chest. The journal was dated, strangely enough, around the same time the last family had lived in the house. And the words described exactly what they had been hearing. Strange voices in the walls, feelings of being watched, the growing sense of dread. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, like a soft shuffling or rustling. Her body tensed, and she turned sharply. But there was nothing, just the dim light of the attic and the suffocating silence. Her breathing slowed as she tried to dismiss the feeling of unease creeping over her. She clutched the journal to her chest, then stood, walking carefully down the stairs. When she reached the landing, she called out to her husband, her voice trembling. "Jacob, something's wrong with this house. We need to leave." Her words were met with silence. She frowned and called out again, louder this time. No response. Panic set in as she hurried down the hallway, checking the rooms. Her heart skipped a beat when she found that the door to their bedroom was ajar. She pushed the door open, and to her horror, the room was empty. Jacob wasn't there. A chilling thought flashed through her mind. The house had done this before, taken people, swallowed them into its walls. Her breath quickened, and she rushed from room to room, calling out his name, her voice trembling with terror. There was no sign of him. Then from the walls came the unmistakable sound of whispering, low, indecipherable murmurs. The walls seemed to tremble, as though something was pushing against them, as if the house itself was alive. The woman backed away slowly, her heart pounding. The walls were closing in, just like the journal had warned. In a panic, she fled the house, running into the street, her body shaking uncontrollably. She glanced back at the house, and for the first time, she saw it clearly, not as the charming, quaint home they had envisioned, but as a dark, foreboding structure, its windows like eyes, watching her every move. She could feel it. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Days passed, but the woman never returned to the house. The police searched the property, but there was no sign of Jacob. It was as though he had vanished without a trace. The woman's claims about the strange events inside the house were dismissed as the ramblings of a frantic mind, but deep down, she knew the truth. The house had claimed another victim, and somewhere within the walls it was waiting for its next. The house on Maple Street sat in silence, its windows dark, its walls thick with secrets. Its doors remained locked, its windows closed, but the whispers never ceased. They waited, patient and persistent, for the next unfortunate soul to step inside. And so the cycle continued. The house on Maple Street remained an ominous presence in the town. No one dared to live in it after the disappearance of Jacob, and the woman's frantic recounting of the events never truly left the whispers of the townsfolk. The real estate agent who had sold them the house vanished soon after, leaving behind a trail of questions and an unsettling feeling in the air. Despite the house's eerie reputation, it wasn't long before another family, unaware of the sinister history, moved into the area. The house had been left vacant for a few months, but the allure of a large, affordable home in the otherwise quiet neighborhood was too tempting to resist. The new family, a father, mother, and their teenage daughter, saw the house as a fresh start. A little quirky, maybe, but nothing a good coat of paint wouldn't fix. At first, everything seemed fine. They set to work on the house, cleaning the overgrown yard, fixing the creaky doors, and making the place livable. The father, John, thought it was the perfect project, and his wife, Evelyn, enjoyed the idea of having a home she could decorate to her taste. Their daughter, Grace, on the other hand, kept to herself. She was a teenager, and the isolation of the house on the outskirts of town didn't appeal to her. But it was a new beginning for the family, and she tried to make the best of it. But as the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. Things would go missing. Tools from the garage, a mug from the kitchen, a book from the shelf, but always just one or two things, enough to make them question whether they had misplaced them. But the events escalated. Grace began hearing soft tapping sounds at night, as though someone, or something, was knocking on her bedroom walls. At first, she blamed it on the old pipes or the house settling, but the more it happened, the more unnerved she became. One night, she was woken by a cold breeze brushing her face. It was the middle of winter, and there hadn't been a draft in her room, but now she could feel it, icy and biting, almost as if someone was standing just at the edge of her bed. She lay frozen under her covers, trying not to make a sound. The tapping continued, and now it was accompanied by a soft whispering, so faint she couldn't make out the words. Fear gripped her chest, and she turned her head to glance at the walls, her heart pounding in her ears. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and the house was silent. Grace lay still, afraid to move, as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Just when she thought it might be her imagination, she heard it, a creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, from the hallway outside her room. Her pulse raced. She had thought her parents were asleep. The footsteps didn't sound like her father's heavy steps or her mother's lighter ones. These were different, almost shuffling, as though the person walking wasn't quite fully present. She quietly pushed herself out of bed and crept toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. As soon as she opened the door, the hallway was empty. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, listening for any sign of movement. But nothing. She stepped out into the hall, glancing down both ends. The house was dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. A soft rustling came from the corner of her eye. She turned, heart hammering, to find the old, cracked mirror at the end of the hall had been dislodged from the wall. It was hanging at an odd angle, barely holding onto the nails that had once secured it. There was no explanation for why it had moved. Had it been like that before? She couldn't remember. But as she stared at her reflection in the dark, she noticed something odd. Behind her, in the mirror, the shadows seemed to move. Something dark and formless shifted, barely visible, yet undeniably there. Her breath caught in her throat, and she backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the mirror. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed the surface, the shadows vanished. Frantic, Grace retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She pulled the covers over her head and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. The strange, haunting presence that seemed to linger in the house was becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning, Grace told her parents what had happened. John and Evelyn, concerned but not wanting to jump to conclusions, assumed it was just her imagination, perhaps stirred by the strange old house. But when they went to investigate the mirror, they discovered it was no longer crooked. It had been fixed back into place, as if nothing had happened. Days passed, but the eerie presence didn't relent. John began hearing odd noises in the walls, like scratching and scurrying. He tried to convince himself it was just the house settling, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking behind the plaster and wood. His wife, Evelyn, had started to feel it too, an inexplicable chill in the air that never seemed to dissipate, no matter how many heaters they turned on. The tension in the house grew thick, and one night, things took a terrifying turn. The family was sitting down for dinner when they heard a loud crash from upstairs. Startled, they rushed to the source of the noise, Grace's room. But when they opened the door, the room was completely untouched, not a single thing out of place. Confused, they checked the rest of the house, searching for any sign of a break-in or intruder. But the house was empty. It felt cold and still, as though it had been waiting. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, the sounds began again, this time louder, more urgent. Grace could hear someone, or something, moving around in the attic. She could feel it moving just beyond her door. The temperature dropped. She felt a presence close behind her, as though it were watching her every move. When she gathered the courage to leave her room, the house felt like a maze of shadows. Every room seemed darker than it should have been, and the air was thick with a suffocating energy that she couldn't explain. She reached the stairs to the attic, and before she could move further, she heard a voice. A whisper. "Leave before it's too late." She spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through her. The walls seemed to be closing in. She turned and fled down the hallway, but something was chasing her. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, echoing in the empty house. She ran faster, desperate to escape, but the house seemed to stretch, the hallways twisting unnaturally, leading her deeper into the darkness. As she reached the living room, she saw her parents standing at the front door, their faces pale and confused. But there was something wrong. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, as though they were staring at something far away. "Mom! Dad!" she whispered, but neither of them responded. Instead, they continued to stare blankly ahead. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The shadowy figure emerging from the walls, its shape almost human, but not quite. It had no face, just darkness where a head should have been. Its hands were long, thin, reaching toward her. She screamed, but it was too late. The shadow enveloped her parents, and they vanished into the darkness. The house on Maple Street had claimed another family, and the whispers continued. The town of Crestwood didn't know it yet, but it had just become home to another tragedy, one that would soon be whispered about for generations to come. The house on Maple Street, once abandoned and left in ruin, was now empty again, its windows dark and hollow. No one would dare move in now. No one ever would. But something continued to stir within those walls, something that had been waiting. Days passed since Grace's disappearance, and the town began to speculate about what had happened to her and her family. Some believed they had run off, escaping from the overwhelming pressure of their new home. Others whispered of something far more sinister, something they couldn't quite put into words. There were stories, of course, old legends of a haunted house and strange happenings stretching back to the time of the first settlers. But no one took those stories seriously. No one except the old woman who lived at the edge of town. Maggie Thompson had lived in Crestwood for most of her life, and she was one of the few who remembered the original residents of the house on Maple Street, the Kingsleys. Their tragic disappearance all those years ago had been swept under the rug, but Maggie knew better. She had seen the shadows in the windows of that house, heard the whispers late at night, and she knew that something dark had always been tied to that house. The last time Maggie had seen Grace was a few days before the disappearance, when she had walked by the house with her friends. She had smiled at the girl as they passed, but there had been a look in Grace's eyes that unsettled her, a look that made Maggie's blood run cold. Now Maggie was the only one who still believed in the stories, still remembered what had been buried beneath the floorboards of that house. She had tried to warn people, but they hadn't listened. They never did. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window at the house on Maple Street. She had a strange feeling, a sense of urgency, that something needed to be done. She had tried to forget the house for years, tried to ignore the whispers and the rumors, but now she couldn't. The memories of the Kingsley family, of their terrified faces, came flooding back. She grabbed her coat, her heart heavy with dread. She didn't know if she was too late, but she had to try. She had to do something before whatever was haunting that house claimed anyone else. Maggie made her way to Maple Street, the air thick with fog. The street was eerily quiet, and the houses around it seemed to hold their breath, as if the very neighborhood knew something terrible was about to happen. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the pale moonlight. When she reached the front gate, Maggie hesitated for a moment. There was no going back once she stepped inside, but she knew what had to be done. She had to confront whatever was trapped inside those walls. The door creaked open as she pushed it, her hand trembling. The house seemed to sigh, as if relieved that someone had finally come. But the air inside was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. The darkness seemed to swallow her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. The silence that answered her was deafening. She moved through the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Each room she passed seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The house seemed alive, its walls closing in around her, and the faint whisper of her name echoed through the halls. "Maggie!" She spun around, but no one was there. Maggie continued to move deeper into the house, her breath catching in her throat with each step. She had to find the attic, the place where the Kingsleys had hidden their secrets, where the darkness had first taken root. She had seen the attic before, but it had been locked the last time. Now it was open. The stairs creaked as she ascended, her hand gripping the banister for support. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. When she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The door to the attic stood open, as if waiting for her. She could feel it, the presence that had been lingering in this house for so long. It was here, in the attic, and it was calling to her. She stepped through the threshold and into the attic. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the small window. The floor was littered with dust and old furniture, abandoned long ago. But it was the walls that caught her attention. There, etched into the walls, were strange markings, symbols and words, written in a hurried, jagged hand. Maggie recognized them from the old stories, the ones that had been passed down from generation to generation. These were not just markings. They were a warning. But before she could make sense of them, she heard a sound. A scraping noise like nails on wood, coming from the far corner of the room. Maggie turned slowly, her blood running cold as she saw a shadow move across the far wall. It was a figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. The figure stepped forward, its face obscured by shadows. But Maggie could see the outline of its eyes, two dark voids, hollow and empty, staring at her with a hunger she could feel in her bones. "Maggie," the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come." Maggie took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew then that there was no escape. The house had claimed her, just like it had claimed the Kingsleys, just like it had claimed the others before them. The figure advanced, its shadow stretching long across the room. The walls seemed to close in around her, the whispers growing louder, drowning out everything else. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, but it didn't move. The whispering stopped too, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. "Maggie," a voice whispered again, but this time it was not from the figure. It was from the walls, from the house itself. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but filled with an unbearable sadness. "The house needs you," the voice continued. "It needs you to stay forever." The shadows seemed to reach out to her, but Maggie couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, her body frozen in place. The darkness enveloped her, and she could feel it, could feel the cold, the emptiness, the void of something ancient and powerful. "Maggie," the voice whispered once more. "Stay." And then, with a final scream, Maggie vanished into the darkness, leaving only the house to stand in silence once again. The whispers would never cease, and the shadows would continue to stretch, waiting for the next person to come to the house on Maple Street. The house would always claim them, and its hunger would never be satisfied. The next morning, Maggie's absence had already caused a stir in the small town of Crestwood. The elderly woman had not returned to her home, and as hours passed, a sense of dread began to settle over the neighbors. The whispers started again, about the house on Maple Street, about the disappearances, and now about Maggie. But no one acted on those whispers. No one except Grace. Grace had been on edge since Maggie's visit the night before. That same unsettled feeling lingered in the pit of her stomach. The house, so cold and indifferent, seemed to be closing in around her again. Her and Jack's renovations had never been finished, and now they felt pointless. She had been trying to force a new beginning into a home that resisted change, but every corner of the house seemed to push her back, reminding her of the past. The walls didn't want to be uncovered, the floorboards didn't want to be walked upon. The house wanted to stay as it was. It wanted to keep its secrets. The morning after Maggie's disappearance, Grace decided to take matters into her own hands. She had to know what had happened. She had to see what Maggie had seen, understand what she had understood. The attic, the marks on the walls, it all pointed to something darker than she could have ever imagined. The house had its own rhythm, its own life, and now it seemed to be calling to her. With Jack still away at work, Grace found herself standing before the attic door again. Her pulse raced in her throat as she placed her hand on the cold, rusty doorknob. She turned it slowly, as if the house might react to the movement, like it could sense her intentions. The door creaked open, and once again, Grace found herself in the suffocating darkness of the attic. But this time, something was different. The atmosphere was heavier, thicker, as though the air had become solid. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any sound could. Grace stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the cracked window. She could feel the house watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. The walls were still adorned with strange symbols, each one more disturbing than the last. The floor was a mess of debris and discarded furniture, much like it had been the night before. But now, something stood out in the center of the room. A large wooden chest, hidden behind an old, tattered rug. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen this chest before. She had been in the attic countless times during the renovation, but this was new. It seemed to have appeared from nowhere, as if it had materialized overnight. Her hands trembled as she approached the chest, her breath shallow in her chest. She knelt down and brushed her fingers across the dusty surface. The chest was old, far older than anything she had seen before in the house. It was covered in intricate carvings, similar to the ones on the walls. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that the markings on the chest seemed to be the same symbols she had seen in the wall's hidden spaces. She wasn't sure whether to be afraid or relieved, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to open it. She reached for the latch, but as soon as her fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to shift. The temperature plummeted, and Grace felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. Her head throbbed with the intensity of it. She could hear her name, distorted and cold, as if the walls themselves were calling to her. "Grace," the voice whispered. She pulled her hand back, but the voice grew louder. "Grace, come closer." With one final breath, Grace unlatched the chest and threw open the lid. Inside, she found a stack of old, yellowed papers. As she pulled them out, her fingers grazed something cold and metallic, something sharp. She gasped as she pulled it out, her eyes wide with horror. It was a ring. A tarnished, silver ring, worn and old, but unmistakable in its design. The symbol on the ring matched the markings on the chest, the walls, and the floor. It was a family crest, twisted and dark, and Grace knew then that the ring had been passed down through generations. But this wasn't just a piece of family history. It was a key to something far more sinister. The moment Grace held the ring in her palm, she felt a surge of energy run through her. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing down on her chest. The walls seemed to close in around her as she struggled to breathe. The whispers grew louder, swirling in her head until she couldn't tell where they were coming from or what they were saying. Then there was a voice, clear, direct, and unearthly. "Return it." Grace's heart froze. She turned around, her eyes wild with fear. But there was nothing in the room. No figure, no shadow, just the oppressive weight of the darkness around her. The voice, however, lingered in her mind, repeating the same words over and over again. "Return it." Grace's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. She realized, with growing dread, that she had uncovered something that wasn't meant to be found. The house had been hiding more than just its past. It had been hiding its hunger, and now it was hungry for her. She stumbled backward, clutching the ring tightly in her palm, but it felt as though it was pulling her toward the floor, toward the heart of the house. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the darkness closed in, swallowing her whole. The whispers reached a crescendo, becoming a cacophony of voices, each one telling her the same thing, to return the ring. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The door slammed shut behind her, and Grace screamed as the house began to consume her, just like it had consumed everyone before her. The house on Maple Street had claimed her, and she would never escape. As the darkness closed in, the last thing Grace heard was the voice again, softer now, as if satisfied. "Welcome home." And the house on Maple Street stood silent once more, waiting for the next soul to uncover its secrets. And that's the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story, then make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel.